Got enough mice?
The wacky world of MultimediaJay.
Okay, that's enough silly pan shots of lots and lots of mice for one night. Oh man, just had to do that at least once. But yeah, thanks to the wonderful world of USB, you can have as many mice plugged into a computer as you want. Doesn't mean you'll actually have use for all of these unless you're some kind of human octopus mutant, and even then, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, I guess you would have your hands full if you had 8 of them. Whatever. You know, a while back I did a discussion about just how easy it was as a PC gamer to have too many game controllers. Well, I think it's plain to see that if you stay involved with PC gaming long enough, you may eventually end up with too many mice. Then again, you know, I'm old. I've been involved with PC gaming since the 2000s. I've had plenty of time to wear out mice and buy new ones, but keep the old ones around to the point where I could do something like this. Oh man, this is basically 20 years of gaming mice right here, of various quality levels, and some other mice as well that aren't plugged in because I ran out of ports on Delosaurus Rex. I decided to leave the most boring mice unplugged because these two don't actually have lights in them. But yeah, so we're not going to do this whole video in low light mode looking like some weirdo Tron setup gone wrong, but the blue actually does go well with some of these mice that I've used over the past couple of years. Some of them. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Monoprice. Whatever. Alright, why don't we just... I think the best thing we could do for me to do some splaining here... Oh yeah, check it out. 3 generations of Intellimouse Explorer 3s. Whatever. Okay, folks. I think the best I could do to start splaining myself is, yeah, let's just start from the beginning. Oh, the thunderstorms must be over. People are actually doing stuff outside again. And it would be nice if I actually had room for a keyboard. Oh, and for trivia, all those extra mice are taking the wattage of Delosaurus Rex into the 30s. So as you can imagine, I had to restart our Delosaurus over here because having all those mice plugged into a computer at once caused the USB controllers to start glitching out when I started trying to unplug them. Next thing I knew, half the USB ports weren't working. So hopefully having only 3 mice plugged in at once will be a lot more of something that this old computer can handle. So let's talk about how we actually got to this point before we get into the mice themselves. So I've had 2 problems. This we'll put this Pictek mouse off to the side here. So I've been having 2 problems with mice lately, even though both of these mice fit perfectly within my little Tron-inspired setup over here. So I've been using Azio, what are these, GM2400s? Yeah, Azio GM2400s. I've been using Azio GM2400s for the last couple of years, and the first one of these mice, they have little comfort rubber grips, which gets a little bit plasticky and somewhat sticky and tacky over the years, or maybe it's just the summer humidity and stuff. The comfort material that they use to make mice more comfortable, instead of being more plasticky, can have issues down the road. But the first one of these Azio mice that I used, I actually spilled something or something like that and took out the mouse wheel. So you couldn't middle click anymore, so whoops! So I got another one. But now they've been discontinued as Azio has gotten away from gaming peripherals towards more boutique type items, like mechanical keyboards that look like typewriters. So the Levetron keyboard that I've liked with its blue theme for years is now discontinued, along with the mouse and whatnot. I think there might be some BTOs I can get through Newegg if I want one of these shipped directly from Hong Kong and have it take like 3 or 4 weeks to get here or something. But I figure, you know what, let's just move on with things, because that's the way it is with technology. Sometimes things change and you have to move on. So I've had 2 problems. First, had to move on from this because it's getting a little hard to move, because I've used this as my main mouse for the last 2 years or so, and I've worn out enough of the rubber on the bottom that I think the mouse is actually dragging, and we might hit some of the paper, and that might start scratching a bit. I could try putting oil on the bottom of the mouse to try and slick it back up, or even hand sanitizer, because it contains glycerin, which is a lubricant. But I could just get some sewing machine oil, try and make this thing glide over a mouse pad again, or I can just get something that isn't as worn out, like this one. This is older, though. This Etekcity mouse goes back to 2015 or so. It was my first attempt at a budget gaming mouse that didn't cost at least $30. And I was kind of surprised that I got pretty decent results out of a $10 mouse. But in today's world, that's what Pictek and Vixing are for. Pictek is the gaming brand and stuff. So I saw this was on sale. When I went to buy the replacement for this, I just picked up one of these just for the heck of it, because one of the problems I've been having in the project area with this mouse being over here, which you may have seen in previous videos, is that the sensor is a little bit more primitive on this old thing. And sometimes when I'm mousing around in the BIOS, the arrow actually glitches out in the BIOS, whereas with this Pictek mouse, it actually works like a normal mouse thing. So older sensors and goofier, crappier sensors used to do that, maybe even in Windows sometimes, where you move the mouse too fast and the pointer goes zzz instead. So to solve that, I was looking for another cheap mouse and a proper successor to these Azios, so I could move on from this brand now that they've been discontinued. And if 4 mice at once doesn't cause this computer to screw up again, we can talk about this one. So basically, this is a Logitech G mouse. What's the exact model on this thing? The G402. So this Logitech G mouse was something I saw on Target, and I was like, you know what? It's been a couple of years since I gave big brands a chance with gaming mice, so let's see how Logitech's doing nowadays. It's a very comfortable mouse, but what this represents in reality with regards to what I've been doing for the last couple of years with mice is something that has changed fundamentally in PC gaming. I don't think we need the extra light. Something that has changed fundamentally in PC gaming is that big brands now have suites of hardware, versus back in the day, you basically had to take regular computer peripherals and try and get them to play video games. So dedicated gaming hardware, including peripherals like gaming mice and gaming keyboards, is a new thing that's really cool. It was around back in the day, sure, but things were sold at a premium back then. Whereas nowadays, I mean, you just wander into Target, pay $30, which used to be the cost of an Intellimouse Explorer, and get a Logitech G for a gaming mouse, and then that can be part of the suite that includes your mouse, your keyboard, gaming headset. You can color coordinate everything, have it all software controlled with software enhancements and firmware updates. There's all this cool stuff that the brands are doing nowadays that just wasn't around back when I was first getting into PC gaming. As a great example of this, some of you folks may have seen this picture over on my community tab, but this is my gaming setup circa 2005. And during the heydays of the Silver Bullet, obviously. Still running the AMD Athlon XP, still really loud, still really hot, still really dying of capacitor plague by Christmas of that year. The old Samsung tube monitor, a Microsoft Digital Media Pro keyboard, and a Logitech MX series gaming mouse, which only very recently had replaced the Intellimouse Explorer 3 that I thought might be getting a little old or a little worn. Boy, did I not know what I was doing back then. What was I watching? Oh, a World War II DVD of a bunch of movies that are probably on archive.org nowadays. They're like, hey, yeah, 30 DVDs, lots of stuff to watch for $5. I was like, what a deal. So yeah, with both computers and movies, I was a fledgling multimedia nerd who didn't have to know what he was doing back then. Klipsch Pro Media 4.1s from college. I didn't even have a 5.1 sound setup yet, because 4.1 was used for gaming and 5.1 was used for movies. But as you can see from this picture, as well as the other ones that I didn't put on my community page, it was not an uncommon thing to just take, except for your self-built computer, of course, it was not an uncommon thing to try and play video games with so-called regular PC peripherals, especially as a college student. You know how many times, my dad was on message boards and he was all worried because that computer that you bought your kid to go to college with and do their schoolwork on, they're going to try and run video games on it. It's going to hurt their GDP. And, well, GDP. No, GPA. It's been too long, man. It's been too long. Yeah, or you could tell I went to college for business because I remember GDP instead of GPA. Whatever. Let's check out some of the other pictures that I didn't put on the community page that go along with this. So how do I click here? Let's click backwards, actually. Silver Bullet in its heyday with a 52-speed CD-ROM to play games with, and a DVD or a CD burner actually, and DVD-ROM because there was a format war, and you had to buy both of these drives in order to get both CD burning and DVD playback at the same time because the combo drives weren't a thing yet. They were slowly taken over once the DVD-ROM format war that everybody forgot about was over with. But yeah, once upon a time, if you wanted CD burning and DVD playback, you needed 2 drives to do that. Audigy front panel drive from back when Creative did that sort of thing, and you could use your computer as a guitar amp. Fan controller, all manual because all the quiet computing things that are a thing nowadays weren't a thing back then. Zip drive, floppy drive. Oh yeah, we're going way back. Mess because I just moved in. Spool full of CDs for playing PC games. And by the way, all the drives back then would sound like a jet plane taking off when they were spinning up every single time it read off the disc. So, and you can see a little hint of my Digital Media Pro keyboard right there, which wasn't a gaming keyboard per se. It was kind of just a multimedia keyboard with media keys and a sleep button, a calculator thing, and volume controls. And here's the support page for the original Guild Wars in Windows XP. And down at the bottom we can see Digital Media Pro. And you saw from the thing I had earlier that I had a Logitech MX Mouse from the MX series, which I thought would be a good successor to the Intellimouse Explorer 3. But let's start going through some of those mice now. Back in the day, back to the Dellosaurus. So, our story begins at the dawning of what was called back then the new millennium. Here I was, young, enthusiastic, multimedia nerd going off to college. I began my PC gaming days with a little, pathetic HP ball mouse that came with the computer. 2 buttons, not even a scroll wheel. I think some of the great SIFT videos from a couple of years ago where I actually went and recycled that thing, So I started with that, then I saw a compact mouse that looked more solidly built, which was the same way. Got that, thought that was an upgrade. Then I thought something with a wheel was an upgrade when I was playing black and white, and I had to hit both mouse buttons to zoom in and out on all the zooming you could do in that game. Optical mice for me began when I got sick of course, messing with ball mice, having to be cleaned out so much. Technically, mechanical mice. To not confuse the youngins who are like, mechanical is always better when it comes to keyboards. My first optical mouse was an HP 800 DPI piece of junk that I got by replying to a spam email. Respond to this, we'll send you a free HP optical mouse. So I did, and I enjoyed it, and I played Battlefield 1942 with it. But around the time I was getting into Elder Scrolls Morrowind, I upgraded to this beast that you've been seeing in the corner of the screen, the Microsoft Intellimouse Explorer 3, and it still works all these years later. Heck, I could fire up Morrowind with this thing, and I would feel right at home. It is aged, well, let me turn on the lights. Unfortunately, it is subject to the rules of plastic over the decades. It is hideous. The plastic is yellowing. Woohoo! Chemical reactions. But the part that isn't hideous because it's old is the silver piece on top. And this is where it has aged the best. From years and years of playing Morrowind and other games and stuff like that, blah 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 blah. This was my last college mouse, by the way. Notice how after 20 years, it moves around nice and smooth. Yay! Unlike that other mouse that I've barely gotten 2 years out of, the Azio and whatnot. But Here's the thing. Because this was silver, and it was the color of the plastic, not some paint finish on top, even as I wore away the paint and put a few scratches in it over the years, it still looks pretty much the way it did 20 years ago. Except for, of course, the parts that are turning yellow. However, it is still very much the Silver Bullets mouse. I don't have a Digital Media Pro keyboard anymore. I went through multiple ones of those through all the wear and tear versus one of these since the early 2000s. Matter of fact, let's crank up some Morrowind and see how at home I feel with the level 2 Breton or whatever I was trying to play the last time I seriously tried to play Morrowind and barely did. Whatever. The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Played with an Intellimouse Explorer 3 that's ugly and turning yellow and has a red LED on the bottom and stuff. Oh, wait, where's my mouse? Ah, there we go. It still feels like it did 20 years ago. Yeah, where was I? Balmora? That's as far as I got, if I remember right. This has no mods, by the way. Oh, yeah. There we go. Low-level Morrowind character, can barely run, can barely jump. Because of the way I always built those darn things, or these darn characters, because I knew that the game was very unbalanced. Oh yeah, look at it. Actually I played the game mostly in first-person mode. Vintage. But look at that vintage scenery, circa the original Xbox era. Do I have Hide UI on here? I don't know. Oh, look! The texture, the pixel shaded water loaded in. Remember when having pixel shaded water was a cool thing? I sure do. This game, by the way, is playing at 1024 by 768, the resolution I played it at back in the day, and I thought that 20 frames per second to 40 frames per second was good performance on my single-core Athlon XP. Oh, this is nostalgia, man. This is absolute nostalgia. But yeah, the Intellimouse Explorer 3. I could say it's the official mouse of the Silver Bullet, but hey, yeah. So yeah, it looks hideous, but this thing is nostalgia. Absolute nostalgia, even if it looks hideous nowadays. And of course, we check on the bottom, we see what would eventually be one of the best things about this mouse is that it was solid on the bottom. It had solid, pad things on the bottom. It had a sensor, even though it's an old red sensor from back in the day. But even still, all these years later, it's great. This is the nostalgia mouse if I were to do some kind of nostalgia build with the Silver Bullet or something like that. Absolute nostalgia mouse. Intellimouse Explorer 3 is hands down a timeless classic for those of us who remember its heyday back in the day. Playing Morrowind on this thing, man, this is the mouse that got me into the sandbox RPGs that I enjoy to this day, even though ESO is an MMO. So, excellent piece of hardware. The biggest problem you had with these things sometimes is either your clicks would mess up, which was a problem with the switches at the time, or your wheel would gum up, and you'd have to take it apart or put a tack in there, or put a push pin in there to scrape it off or something. And on the newer versions of this, there's actually a circuit board that the bottom of the wheel would scrape up against when it got too much gunk on it, so you could just sand down the circuit board and everything would be perfect afterwards. But this thing is not quite as loose as it used to be, but hey, I could still play games with this thing like 20 years later. Intellimouse Explorer 3. This is the most nostalgic mouse I have, so the amount of screen time the other mice are going to take up is going to be nowhere near this. But eventually, I thought my Intellimouse Explorer 3 was getting old, and I foolishly decided to move on. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're young and dumb, you make stupid mistakes known as youthful indiscretions, some nerdier than others. Ladies and gentlemen, it has no lights, except for its little blinky sensor. It is a hideous piece of junk. It is a stand-in for the mouse I tried replacing Intellimouse Explorer 3 with. I didn't pay any money for this thing. It was a bundled mouse that I got with a keyboard mouse bundle. I think it came with one of my Digital Media Pros that I used over the years back in the 2000s. But it represents every way in which Microsoft went wrong with mice after the digital media, or the Intellimouse Explorer 3. So there's only one button that I think is only used as a back button on here. But this is the Comfort Optical Mouse 3000, version 1.0. And this thing has all the technology that Microsoft played around with in the 2000s. And the reason why I have it here is because when I replaced my Intellimouse Explorer 3, my first logical choice was the Intellimouse Explorer 4. Those of you who are into computer stuff, have you ever heard of the Intellimouse Explorer 4 without Googling it or looking on Wikipedia? Maybe you haven't, because it was a poor successor to the Intellimouse Explorer 3. Microsoft went back towards the Office side of things and emphasized Office comfort over gaming performance. And so you had this right here, a no-click wheel, nice and smooth for browsing web pages, very easy on your fingers when you're doing accounting work at the office all day. But you also had middle click, and you also had a wheel that could tilt click left and right. Yeah, I think this one still does it, just hard to do in its old age. It would tilt click left and right. Problem is, all that stuff was done through software. So when something as simple as middle clicking had latency issues. You had to hold the button down a bit for it to register. And only one button on the side instead of two. And of course, some people were counting the clicks when they were, for example, switching weapons in Battlefield 1942 or switching spells in Elder Scrolls Morrowind. And so we have this. Now, this mouse has barely been used. The only time I've used it is when I haven't had anything else, and I don't even think it's registering. I don't even think it registered with the computer and started moving around. No, I'm not getting a pointer on screen, so it gets power, but it doesn't actually. Oh, okay. I can right click, but I don't have a pointer, or is it just too fast? I don't know. Either way, garbage. I don't even know why I still have this thing. I really should just toss it out. But yeah, and at least the thing blinked when it was off the ground and stuff like that. This mouse was also the first mouse where I had problems with moving the mouse too fast makes the pointer glitch. So yeah, it represents, well, the reason why I don't say very nice things about the Intellimouse Explorer 4, because it had all this crap in it. Really, Microsoft reinvented the wheel when they didn't have to. But as we know from history and how many gaming mice are obviously inspired by the Intellimouse Explorer 3, not the Intellimouse Explorer 4, I believe the rest is history. The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. It gets no more mid-2000s than this. And what a mouse to play Oblivion on than the first successful, somewhat, successor to the Intellimouse Explorer 3. After the little fiasco with the Intellimouse Explorer 4, I decided to check out Logitech for the first time, because Logitech and Microsoft were rival brands. And Microsoft and Logitech basically made rival everything. Nowadays, of course, you have all the gaming peripherals, and you have office peripherals and stuff, but back then it was much simpler times. Unfortunately, much like the Intellimouse Explorer 3, this, my final of the Logitech MX mice, has aged the worst. One of the first things we ran into, and let's get out of Oblivion while we're playing with this stuff. Go back to the desktop. One of the worst things that, of course, would happen was, well, Microsoft was sending a lot of peripherals to office setups and things like that back in those days. And yeah, Logitech was more of a consumer quality brand, meaning the quality could be worse. And it was. I mean, these mice seemed like they were good successors to the Intellimouse Explorer 3 when I first got them. But, So I had multiple ones of these. And don't forget, I had the Intellimouse Explorer 3 the entire time that I was using that I was using these things and burning through them. The first one of these things, I had problems where everything wore out, and eventually the cord kind of went intermittent around here somewhere, so I kept losing my mouse and trying to game. Not a sort of thing that you want to have happen. But all of them had the same problems. Actual wear and tear on the plastic. This comfort rubbery plastic has aged poorly. It is actually incredibly sticky unless I clean the whole mouse with oil. If I clean it with alcohol, it gets like glue like this. You have a little thumb cave for your thumb. I mean, it's ergonomic and stuff, and it's actually more ergonomic than the Microsoft one because it keeps your wrist at a more neutral position. It had a clicky scroll wheel, not none of that software stuff. You could middle click, and there was even primitive DPI type adjustments if you had the right software, things like that. And it even had the 2 buttons on the side, and they were more solid than Microsoft's. But here's where your problems began as you used Logitech MX series gaming mice. This is an MX 518, and I can only tell you that because there's barely any of it left on the label. Look at what little is left on the bottom of this mouse. So it would start with 6 of these. It would start with 6 of these little grommets. Those would come loose. They'd slide around the bottom and eventually slide off. So now you have raw plastic against your mousing surface. And then you would have. Then the paper, fortunately it didn't happen with this one, then the paper would probably start curling, and it would eventually start getting caught in its own label as the label slowly peeled off. This one, however, I kept cleaning with alcohol and stuff and keeping it smooth so that it wore out to this state instead of labels peeling off and things like that, and it's just horrible. When you compare this to the Intellimouse Explorer, I mean, it just aged poorly. And having sat in a bag, because I've had next to no use for that, I think I'm going to throw this thing out, finally. This can be the last Logitech MX mouse that I ever have here. Yeah, so, of course, it is aged poorly. The comfort material is even pockmarked and everything. If I don't put oil on this, it is very, very sticky, very, very rubbery, or very, very sticky and like rubber gone wrong and stuff like that. It technically still works, but that's not saying much. Matter of fact, I think I need to go wash my hands now that I've handled this thing. So, as you can tell, as I felt like the quality had degraded as I went through multiple of these Logitech mice within the span of a few years, I started to long for the good old days of the Intellimouse Explorer 3, and eventually I caved and hooked my old Intellimouse Explorer 3 back up and marveled at how, for example, the harder material on the bottom hadn't broken off, unlike the little grommets on the bottom of this thing. But Microsoft eventually heard the cries of frustrated former Intellimouse Explorer 3 owners and brought the mouse back in the late 2000s.
Skyrim belongs to the Nords!
And as the 2010s started becoming a thing, this became a thing again. Just Alt F4 this thing. Ooh, it doesn't. Hold on. Let's get out of Skyrim here with a mouse that should be very, very obvious. It looks like the Darth Vader mouse when there's not a lot of extra light going around. But at least, unlike its predecessor, it has a sensor that turns off when it's not on a mousing surface. It is the Blackout Edition re-release of the Intellimouse Explorer 3. This was my Skyrim mouse of choice. This came out in the late 2000s, and as you can tell from the wear and tear, I completely ran it into the ground. Having experienced crappy mice for so many years before getting to this thing, I decided to run this thing as far into the ground as I possibly could. So I did. Played Skyrim on this, then I played Guild Wars 2, blah blah blah. I spent years just totally running this mouse into the ground, and probably got more years out of this mouse than out of the original Intellimouse Explorer. And it shows too with what didn't improve with it. So you've got clicks and whatnot. I actually wound up grinding down that circuit board that got in the way of the mouse wheel spinning. But at the same time, Logitech had mice that were out at the time where you could turn off the click and spin the wheel freely and then turn it back on later. Buttons were kind of similar and whatnot. But one big difference versus the OG Intellimouse Explorer 3 was the creak factor. If you squeeze one of these mice, you can hear it creak. You can hear it creak a little. This one did not. It was actually built more solidly than the one that came before it, in that area at least. But notice the difference. Notice that all the decals and stuff are still on this mouse, even though it's turning yellow. But over here, everything wore off. So, some changes, some things were better in the re-release of the Intellimouse Explorer 3, and some were not. There's really no reason for me to keep this mouse. I mean, you can actually see the wear marks, because there is supposed to be, this came with originally a finish and whatnot, but as you, of course, had your hand in the same position, playing the same games over and over again, and clicking and dragging and all that lovely stuff, you would eventually actually wear it down like this. So, and I definitely used this mouse enough to wear the living daylights out of it. But even the comfort material is a little sticky, or it was until I cleaned it, unlike its Logitech counterpart, which got worse when I cleaned it with the alcohol. So I absolutely wore this mouse out because its predecessor was so good. And here's the redo of it. You can see, of course, there's the feet on the bottom are more solid and whatnot, and so it didn't have a problem. There were no labels to peel off, so it never had that problem. But by and large, still works great to this day. It just feels a little worn, and it looks definitely like it's worn. And this was the heyday of my involvement with big brand mice, because the gaming brands that are out nowadays weren't a thing yet. So you had Microsoft and Logitech and a couple other companies trying to get themselves established, but no hardware suites like what we have today, where you can have a gaming headset, a mouse, a mechanical keyboard, you know, RGB lighting all over the place, and all that other fancy crap. But hey, when the lights go down, it had a nice little Darth Vader thing to it. I ran this mouse into the ground for years until I was like, you know what? This thing is so worn out, and I wonder, with branded mice costing $40, $50, $60, and mice other than the Intellimouse Explorer not having all that great a quality, plus Microsoft discontinued the Intellimouse Explorer after this thing's heyday, I was like, you know what? Do I really need to spend any decent amount of money to get a decent gaming mouse? The answer, of course, was no, and it stayed that way for years. Ladies and gentlemen, the Intellimouse Explorer 3, the last of the ones I ever had of that series, before the years of the off-brands. Dun 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 dun. It was the 2010s, and PC gaming had taken a turn towards the dark side, or as some would call it today, the dark mode side. Let there be light! Behold, the successor to the Intellimouse Explorer 3, for me, my first foray into budget brand gaming mice, and a pretty darn good choice at that, at only $10. I was very seriously wondering if you were buying a brand by buying something like a Razer Death Adder. So I decided to poke around Amazon and try one of these out, because if it didn't work, I had a perfectly usable, if well worn, Intellimouse Explorer 3 to go back to. And it was awesome. This is the Etekcity $10 gaming mouse circa the middle of the 2010s. Of course, it has a little red thing on the bottom and things along those lines. Circa the Windows, circa the mid-2010s for me. This was where I started moving towards lights and blue and being on the blue team and stuff like that. No RGB lighting. You can't adjust the color of this thing. But in terms of a Tron mouse, this is absolutely it. It's an Intellimouse Explorer 3 that lights up if you just cover up that red sensor. The issue I had is the LEDs inside are more old school, so if you're watching like something from over here, it could glare right in your eye. I was so tempted to just open this thing up and bend those LEDs so they pointed more upwards. But in terms of a Tron mouse, this Etekcity was perfect. Similar to the Intellimouse Explorer 3, it had plastic instead of comfort rubber type stuff, so it didn't get stickier as it aged, and it just swings all over the place. Still does pretty well now. The issue is that the sensor wasn't as good as the Intellimouse Explorers that I was using beforehand. But it had the lights, it had the looks, and eventually when I got sick of the rather cheap feel of it, it had me thinking, well, let's try something else here. But hey, from an introduction to Geek House Dark Mode style mice, it was a pretty darn good one. Although it was a step backwards in some ways from the Intellimouse Explorer 3. But hey, $10. Who said you had to spend extra money to pay a premium to buy a brand, or buy a label, or buy a name? The year was 2016. Jay's Geek House had become a thing. And having gone too far in the other direction, with mice that were off-brand and a little too cheap, I decided to go for more bang for buck, but not a brand that I'd never actually heard of before. And at this time, this was the peak of my Monoprice years, where I was thinking that Monoprice was like the Aldi of home electronics. At one point, Monoprice decided to start releasing a gaming mouse, and so we have this thing. RGB for the Monoprice M, but I don't think there was ever any software to control this, and I think this was stuck as green, so it never really fit it never really fit my whole thing with the color matching stuff that I'd have nowadays. Still a perfectly good gaming mouse, even if it kind of gets a little concave down towards the ends, things like that. Obviously based again on Intellimouse Explorer, plastic, including the plasticky buttons and things like that. The sensor was also red, but it was hidden under there somewhere. By the Monoprice 11155. I eventually wound up, this is a perfectly good mouse. I put up with the colors not being what I was looking for a while, until I started running into problems with the mouse going intermittent. So I think, unlike before, it does have a braided cable and everything, my first mouse to do so. Unlike before, where it went intermittent here, I think it actually started going intermittent around the plug for some reason. Yep, there it goes. Or you can just wiggle it in the jack. And you'd have to kind of do this a bit, and get it plugged back in, and stuff like that. So yeah, it wasn't good when I shook the mouse a little too much. And it died. So, this mouse has probably taken the least wear and tear out of any mouse I've ever had. But because it went intermittent and it was unreliable, wound up retiring it, I probably shouldn't even still have it. But fundamentally, I decided to move in the direction of let's pick another brand that isn't a no-name brand, but isn't a big brand either. Keep in mind, around the time I was retiring this mouse, Microsoft was reintroducing the Intellimouse Explorer back to the market. But at that time I was like, I don't want to spend money on buying a name. Let's try another brand, and let's try and color coordinate everything. And let's try to take the back path into the branded gaming peripherals market that was popping up on the horizon. Especially as Geek House Dark Mode and going for the whole Tron look and whatnot was something I was very much going for by the late 2010s. Especially as smart lighting technology would start to become more affordable, and LED technology was becoming more versatile. And as my drive towards Geek House Dark Mode continued in the late 2010s, we eventually arrived at the heyday of the Azio Levetron. That time where I had the most matching branded gear as a PC gamer, instead of mix and match stuff like what I'm doing nowadays. The Tron look was in full swing. And I know it looks like it's probably pronounced Azio, but I've actually seen some videos where people from this company call it Azio. In the heydays of the Azio Levetron, we of course had these light-up blue Tron-style keyboards. This is the membrane version. I have since upgraded to the mechanical version, because both keyboards have a nice volume knob on them. I know it's a simple little detail, but there are of course volume sliders and volume buttons nowadays, but having a knob you can turn, similar to an old school radio, is still a cool thing if your computer can have a volume knob. But the Azio Levetron was sold as just a keyboard, just a mouse, or as a bundle. And there were times, particularly as this stuff started approaching being discontinued, that it was more worth it to buy the bundled keyboard and mouse than it was to buy the individual mouse. Depends on what went out of stock where. This is the peak time for me having matching gear like this. The mouse, if we go to light mode here, is the Azio GM2400. Obviously stands for gaming mouse. It has a little red sensor hidden in there, even though everything else LED-wise is blue. This was my gaming mouse of choice for years. It was a comfortable mouse, really nice, real easy to work with. However, my first one, I broke it. It's my fault. I spilled something on it, and the middle click died, and stuff like that. So I wound up getting a second one. But hey, you could say that this has been my gaming mouse of choice since the late 2010s. The problem I've run into, and the reason we're here today, is, number one, similar to other comfort mice I've had with this rubbery coating on top, the rubbery coating started getting sticky, and the mouse is really starting to drag in its old age. If we look on the bottom, we see the rubber pads on the bottom are kind of worn at this point. I think in some cases they're almost down to the plastic, so it doesn't glide quite like it used to. I'm gonna try putting some oil on this to see if I can fix that up a bit. But I noticed when I cleaned this off with alcohol, similar to the Logitech mice, it actually got worse and the material got stickier. So, considering how much of a chore it is to move this thing around and it doesn't glide like it used to, I'd say the heyday of this mouse is pretty much over. So when it comes to maintaining these things, there's oil and there's alcohol, and the Azio mouse required the most complicated maintenance thing of them all. Oil the bottom, alcohol the top. But once we've done all that, I'd say the mouse, even though it still drags quite a bit, is still somewhat useful. But hey, it still looks the part with the whole Tron look and things like that. But of course, just this thing, it works for now, only until the oil wears off. Then it's going to start dragging again. And so, considering there are wear spots on this, where we can see, for example, we can see the spots where pressing against the rubbery coating has worn things a bit on both sides from all the clicking over years and things like that. We can see, of course, that this thing does have some wear spots. It has rubber stuff on the top, so it's going to become messier and messier as the mouse continues to age. So, it just drags. So, the wear on the bottom, even with the oil, still means that this mouse drags like few others. Intellimouse Explorer 3, it ain't. I mean, it takes effort just to swing the mouse around this much. This is one of those little things that starts adding up as you use a mouse over and over again. You don't notice how much more strain it's putting on you with what you're doing here. And plus, I mean, who wants to have to keep a thing of oil near their computer because of their mouse? I mean, these things should take care of themselves-ish or whatever. Well, I never had to do this with the Intellimouse Explorer 3, I'll tell you that much. But yeah, it had its day. But the big reason why we're here and why we're doing these experiments is because Azio has moved away from this stuff in more recent years. They've moved towards more boutique-type products, more specialty-type products, like mechanical keyboards that are like typewriters, and kind of style products and things like that. Not necessarily trying to squeeze in with the gaming hardware brands, such as Logitech G, Corsair, and SteelSeries and stuff like that. So basically, this mouse has been discontinued since I've worn out mouses, whatever. Since I've worn out mice a lot faster than I've worn out keyboards, it was inevitable that I would have to move on from this Azio mouse anyways. And so that's where I started looking for what its successor would be. So first we'll take a look at the mouse that falls into the category of let's see how much we can get out of a cheap mouse in the 2020s. This is the Pictek entry-level mouse. Basically, it hangs out around the $10 to $15 mark. It's what they call the entry-level mouse with DPI adjustment, and actually the lighting is RGB, so right now I have it set to blue to match my blue theme, but I can change this to other colors as well using the software. The fun part is, and we'll get into this with the Logitech G shortly, the software isn't constantly updating the mouse. You can actually save your settings onto the mouse with the software so that when you unplug the mouse, everything stays the same until you install the software somewhere else and pick up where you left off. We'll get to that shortly with the Logitech G. But this Pictek is actually pretty decent. If you've never heard of Pictek before, it's what I call Amazon brands. So, you have three kinds of brands of gaming peripherals if you poke around Amazon these days. You have the no brands that you've never heard of. You have the Amazon brands that have a regular assortment of products, but you only see it on Amazon because it's a budget brand. And then you have the big brands. Assuming you don't just buy office gear and try to game with it, you'll have the big brands like SteelSeries, Razer, Logitech G, and whatnot, where you have a big suite of products, gaming headsets to match, and software to run it all, and special drivers, and all that fancy stuff. But the Amazon brands can be pretty decent. So this is the Pictek T7. Pictek and VictSing are the same company, but Pictek is the gaming brand, VictSing is the office brand. So if some of this looks familiar to some VictSing stuff you might have seen on Amazon. Well, so anyways, this Pictek mouse, pretty decent for an entry-level mouse. It's got a decent sensor. The obvious comparison here, if we go back to Tron mode here, is with the Etekcity from the mid-2010s. So there's a couple of notable differences here. The sensor on this thing is much improved from its Etekcity forerunner years and years ago. The problem is, this mouse actually hurts my hand because of the ergonomics. It's a little too small for me. I never thought about mouse size until I started trying to use this Pictek and noticed my hands started getting sore. First, the more ergonomic mice will keep your wrist at a more neutral angle instead of flattening it out so much. Second, a mouse that is too small makes you want to do this. Makes you want to just, keep your palm on the rest and just move around and only click like this. Similar to if you're using a laptop mouse or a travel mouse, which doesn't really work well for hours and hours and hours of gaming. Sure, if you're doing occasional mouse clicking because you're working on a laptop or something, this would be fine. But if you're playing ESO for 6, 7, 8 hours or something like that, no, I can't even get past the 1 hour mark before my hand starts hurting because the mouse is a little bit too small. Mouse a little bit too small and the ergonomics come up a little short. But otherwise, it's a perfectly solid gaming mouse. The buttons are a little goofy. But other than that, it's perfectly solid. Doesn't creak when you try and squeeze it. Has a little hidden red sensor despite being set to blue right now. And the interesting thing is, we talk about the materials on these things, plastic versus the comfort rubber or whatever you want to call it. This does not have any of the comfort material at all. It is pure plastic. So I imagine as I use it, it'll just get shinier. It won't start getting sticky or tacky or something along those lines. It glides easily on the bottom. There's plenty of stuff left on the rubber things and whatnot. The problem is it's just too small. Ergonomically, the Etekcity, and of course this mouse was re-released with other Amazon brands in more recent years, but this blue-only Etekcity mouse was more comfortable as a successor to the Intellimouse Explorer. So what I think I'm going to do with this Pictek mouse, because the sensor is better than the Etekcity, which was glitching out when I was trying to use the mouse cursor in the BIOS. Because the sensor is better, the Pictek is going to be over here in the project area. Now, Pictek has a larger gaming mouse, similar to the Etekcity that I could try out, but I have no reason to buy one right now because I have a Logitech G to wear out first. So I might check out Pictek's larger offerings when I wear out the Logitech G1 or something like that, or maybe finish running this thing into the ground. Although this thing wasn't all that great for like World of Warcraft PvP and stuff, and the sensor's not quite as good. One thing you run into with sensors is that you try and make precise movements and it jerks a little, versus with newer sensors you can keep it a lot smoother, a lot easier. So the Pictek is actually a good mouse to have in the project area where I'm just doing some occasional mouse clicking and stuff. But for my main setup, it just doesn't cut the mustard because it's too small. If you have smaller hands and you're not a fat guy like me, maybe this will be comfortable for you. It definitely would be if my hands weren't too big for it. But either way, Pictek does have some larger mice. I might check one out one of these days. For now, let's check out the Logitech G and talk about the ups and downs of my first foray into the big brands that aren't like Azio trying to break into the space a couple of years ago. And now, the major leagues, the big brands. The big brands with ties into commercial deals, esports, personalized gear, the whole 9 yards, like this Logitech G Shroud Collection. I've been using Logitech my whole life, so it only made sense that I would have some kind of Logitech G, whatever you want to call it. I've been using Logitech my whole life. This was kind of a no-brainer. This is where you get the tie-ins to commercial stuff, esports, professional gaming, things like that. The stuff that gaming gear is known for. The big brands with a big suite of products, and Logitech G is one of them. So I've avoided this scene because I figured there was probably an unnecessary price premium to some of this, but when I was wandering through Target, I figured I'd check out a Logitech G mouse. The mouse I had was wearing out, so I was like, well, you know what, let's try this one out, and this is actually one of the most comfortable gaming mice I've ever used. The sensor is definitely a lot better. I can see the precision and everything. I can see, now let's close the web browser. I can see the precision and everything when playing ESO with this, and I can definitely say that if I stream with this mouse, I will probably get better looking camera work swinging the camera around with this than I did with the dragging GM Azio one that I was using earlier. So this is the Logitech G402, so not too expensive. Get your foot in the door with Logitech G, and I can definitely tell this is part of a suite of products that I'm supposed to fall in love with. Although it does have the old Logitech thing where they try and be better with the ergonomics by not flattening your hand out as much. So we have here, I mean, it's a decent sized mouse, but it keeps my hand kind of at an angle versus the Pictek, which tends to flatten it out a little more. So, but the thing is, the problem I have with this mouse, and the reason why I probably want to just run it into the ground and be done with this stuff, the Logitech G mouse is too controlled by its software. There are way too many tie-ins to the built-in software, not enough stuff stored on the hardware itself. As an example, these two buttons right here, are they additional buttons? No, it's actually, these three buttons right here. Are these additional buttons? Sort of. They're DPI adjustments. The idea is if you have to adjust your DPI on the fly, like for a precision shot or something, you hold down the thumb button and then you use these buttons to select a new DPI on the fly, and the minute you release the thumb button, you're back to what you were doing earlier. So I would much rather have these as programmable action buttons. But the big issue I have Besides, of course, the cosmetic thing where the blue of the Logitech G, which you can't adjust, by the way, it's only this color on this mouse, is not quite as blue as the Pictek and the Azio stuff that I was using, so it doesn't match my color scheme perfectly. But cosmetic stuff aside, the big problem I have here is that this mouse is so tied into the Logitech G software that your mouse will start out at incredibly slow 400 DPI. You gotta do this just to get across from one end of the screen to the other until the Logitech G software starts up, in which point your mouse reinstalls every single time you start your computer back up, and then your pointer will move at a decent speed. So it is way, way, way too tied in as software. Not enough stuff is stored on the mouse itself. So when you take it to another USB port or something else like that, or sometimes it just glitches out and everything kind of slows down on you and you gotta keep opening the software to set it back. Now I came to this Logitech G mouse from a roughly 1200 DPI Azio GM 2400, whatever the heck it was, I forgot already. The Azio mouse that I was using was around 1200 DPI. This thing could be like 1200 to 1600 easily, but you can also go into the Windows control panel and increase your mouse speed to get your mouse speed back without having to install the G software. But does it screw up when you restart? Blah, 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 blah. Bottom line, there's way too much of a tie-in with the Logitech G software for this G mouse to really stand on its own anywhere except Monolith. And even then, it's a little annoying having your mouse be super slow until the G software starts up and you get all your speed back. That's where I have it programmed so that these DPI lights all turn on. So when I go from 1 light to 3 lights, I know I've gone from slow mode to finally having some normal mouse speed. So it's an extremely comfortable mouse to work with, though. It has the rubbery, it has somewhat between plastic and rubber on top. I don't know if this thing's going to get sticky as it gets older, but maybe it's just a rough plastic that isn't as smooth as the Pictek mouse. But, I mean, it is extremely comfortable. I can play ESO for hours with this, no problems, once I get the speed right. So, that's the issue. So I don't really see myself as being a Logitech G kind of guy for any longer than this mouse. I'm going to run this thing into the ground, and that's going to be that with that. Which means I'm going to have to answer this question of what mouse to go with again sooner rather than later. Fortunately, there is one more wild card in all of this. Although I should probably illustrate with the old Logitech mouse before we move on that, yep, the hand's at an angle like this, more ergonomic. The hand's at an angle like this, more ergonomic. The rivalry between Microsoft and Logitech from the olden days is properly represented here, except on the Microsoft side. However, a while back, we mentioned that while I've been playing around with these cheapo brands of mice, Microsoft reintroduced the Intellimouse Explorer. People wanted it for years, and in the late 2010s, Microsoft finally did it. Now, Microsoft, by the time Microsoft was doing this, I was like, nah, I don't need to spend money on a big brand anything anymore. I'm fine with these cheap brands. They do the job, they do the trick just fine. Well, now that I've made a renaissance to the Logitech side of things, I felt it was only proper to give the new Intellimouse a proper spin. Oh yeah, this is the mouse that I went to pick up on Amazon and then picked up this little cutie on the side for $10 more. Let's plug this sucker in and revisit this old rivalry. For me, going all the way back to the 2000s. This 20-year-old rivalry. What does it look like in the 2020s? In 20 years, we've gone from this to this. Not much has changed. We've gone all around the world to come back to where we started. Another one of those things. It's my Morrowind mouse from the Silver Bullet. It's one of the best mice I've ever had, but it's getting old. It's yellowing, looking ugly. This thing didn't age well at all. However, much like its Logitech successor, it keeps the hand at more of an ergonomic angle. So we got the same thing going on here. So yeah, 20 years. We've gone from this to this. This is the Microsoft Classic Intellimouse, the first one that came out. There's also the Intellimouse, the Pro Intellimouse, which upgrades the sensor in this, although this was a modernization job in and of itself. First, sensors modernized. We look at the bottom. there's nothing to peel off like with the Logitechs of days gone by. So it's got a more kind of nice little blue sensor and whatnot. And by and large, it feels like an Intellimouse. Does it creak? Not as much as the original did. A little bit more than the Blackout Edition, but that one was broken in. It feels like an Intellimouse. Microsoft didn't try anything fancy, which makes me wonder if the wheel might gum up if the camera can stay focused. Has a nice Blackout Edition that kind of reflects the Microsoft Surface look to things, and when you place the thing down, instead of a red light coming on, a little white LED turns on. So this doesn't fit my color scheme at all, unless the monitor reflects off the mouse. It's very, very neutral in a sense. You pick it up, you put it back down, and the camera goes out of focus. The Pro version of this has an RGB light that can be adjusted. By and large, this feels like an Intellimouse. Oh, and while we're at it, you can install the mouse software, the Microsoft Mouse and Keyboard Center software on here to adjust the DPI of this mouse, but it saves to the hardware, unlike the slow Logitech. So, we have a situation where the Logitech G is a little more comfortable, so I'm going to probably wear that one out first. But this one is a pretty darn good mouse. There's a better version of it out nowadays, but it does have a little bit of jerkiness, so you try and do precision movements with it. But there is a newer version of this now, the Intellimouse Pro, which I'll probably check out at some point later on, and maybe it won't cost as much by then. But for now, I gotta see how this one ages, because we know the Blackout Edition got lots of wear marks and things like that. And it looks like this has some kind of finish to it that's going to wear through and turn into raw plastic at some point. But hey, the Intellimouse is back. So since we started with Morrowind, let's play some Morrowind with the Intellimouse Classic. Morrowind! Yeah, I'm not going to play too much with the spider tripod here, but it's 1024 by 768 anyways, because I'm not running OpenMW. But let's load this in here. Let's do like quick save. Let's just grab that quick save again where the guy can barely move. Valvora! Ah, yeah! Yay! It feels like the old Intellimouse, but it doesn't feel 100% like the old Intellimouse, probably because it's been decades since I played Morrowind with a brand new Intellimouse Explorer of any kind. But yeah, it does have the feel of the old Intellimouse, which makes me wonder how much better things get with the Intellimouse Pro, or whether I'll have the wheel gum up and stuff. But I don't want to have, or the mouse wheel. I don't want to have a situation where I never really get to try out the Classic, and since the Pro is an upgrade from the Classic, I think what I want to do is try playing with the Classic first. Like a moonwalking down the side like that. I think what I want to do is play with the Classic first. Yeah. Woo! Water walking! There we go. How long does that last? Like 30 seconds? But yeah, click into the menu, equip an iron longsword, equip this. The issue is the DPI is a little higher, so it's a little jerky compared to what I remember. Oh yeah, you gotta drag it to your picture to equip it. Yeah. It feels like an Intellimouse, though. I'm trying to zoom the camera out. There was no zoom in Morrowind. Yeah, it feels like it does feel like an Intellimouse. But considering Microsoft was very, very conservative with the design, with not even putting in DPI buttons, not even a braided cord on this re-release, having it feel like an Intellimouse is just fine and dandy. Let's trade up to a much newer Elder Scrolls game, though. Paladins at the ready! Oh yeah, I couldn't test this Intellimouse out without doing some kind of ESO at some point. And I would definitely say that much as the original Intellimouse Explorer played nice with Morrowind, this plays nice with Elder Scrolls Online. Of course, the sensor's not as good as the Intellimouse Pro, but we're talking MMOs here. If I get into first-person shooters and stuff and I try to jettison my MMO aim, or whatever you want to call it, maybe I could try something with a newer sensor. But as it stands, especially this being Delosaurus Rex, so the graphics are not going to be as high as on some of the other systems, because it's the new efficiency system. I would say this definitely feels pretty decent. Not bad if I do say so myself. You can actually go outside. We could go outside the city and fight something, but I know it's clicky mice. You dodge with the bumper button, change and stuff like change weapons and whatnot with the side button. The side button feels more solid on this than it did on the Blackout Edition re-release that came out in the late 2000s. I don't know if it's because this mouse is new and hasn't been broken in yet, but Microsoft tried to stiffen up the build a little to give it some more durability and stuff. And of course you have the Intellimouse Pro, which iterated on this even more. But it's nice to see that some kind of Intellimouse Explorer has made its way back into the wonderful world of gaming. It doesn't match any of my color schemes or anything, but it sure feels good. This is the sort of mouse that I'd keep around just for nostalgia's sake. So if I want to, what was it like in the good old days? Remember the good old days? Bust out the Intellimouse. And it wouldn't be the first time I did that either. I used to keep a Microsoft Natural ready to plug in at a moment's notice in my desk drawer for typing out longer stuff, like blog entries and things like that. I could just as easily put this Intellimouse Classic in a desk drawer in case I want to go back to the nostalgic feeling of Morrowind in ESO, or even playing Morrowind again sometime. But I definitely would say that Elder Scrolls and an Intellimouse Explorer is a combination I will always respect, because of the heydays of Morrowind and the heydays of the Intellimouse Explorer 3. And there it is in its natural habitat. It feels like an Intellimouse, it's as light as an Intellimouse, although today's mice can be lighter. It goes woo 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 just as easily as the Intellimouses of yore. Woo 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 if you want to do that kind of thing. It feels like an Intellimouse because it is an Intellimouse. Just doesn't fit my color scheme any. Although the Intellimouse Pro, I can change the color of this light to be blue to match all this other stuff. But that would be the extent of it. Everything else would have to be a mod project, which I don't feel like doing with an Intellimouse. So, how do we proceed then? We have a super comfortable Logitech G mouse. Since I paid for it, I'm going to run that one into the ground and probably switch to this. And then when this gets some wear and tear on it, maybe there'll be some successor to the Intellimouse Pro that I can check out, or the Intellimouse Pro will be less expensive. But as it stands, over 20 years of Mice and MultimediaJay, we've gone around the world to come back to familiar territory once again. Let's plug the Intellimouse, the OG Intellimouse, back in. And we can see these kind of like, ancestors meeting descendants. They look similar, they feel similar, and darn it, they're pretty good mice. Even if I am biased by my own sentimental value. We'll definitely keep the OG Intellimouse around as we break this one in and see what the difference is between the two. But many of the mice you saw today, this is going to be the last time you see them. Because in today's world, where you're not spending $30, $40, $50+ for good mice, whether you get an Amazon brand, or a big brand, or an Intellimouse re-release. We're in a day and age where you just don't have to keep worn-out mice around anymore. I mean, once upon a time, you wanted to make your Intellimouse last as long as possible, because there wasn't much in terms of functional competition. But with the Razer Death Adder, the Amazon brands, Steel Series, other stuff from Razer, stuff from Corsair, the big brands and their suites, even Logitech G, PC gaming is in a very different place versus 20 years ago. And I think it is all the better because of it. Gaming being more mainstream through wonderful things like esports and all kinds of other stuff has transformed gaming from, just something you do with your computer when you're not doing work, into an enjoying hobby to be reckoned with in today's day and age. So, the world of peripherals is changing since I go through mice faster than I go through keyboards, because of course the extra stress of moving things around and having your hand on it all the time versus only the buttons you use the most will wear out the quickest on a keyboard. And with a mechanical keyboard you can swap out keycaps and stuff, so you're actually waiting for something electronic to break before you replace one of those. But in terms of mice, there really is no need to hold on to old mice for reasons other than YouTube videos. And quite frankly, who wants to see a YouTube video of a crappy, worn-out, awful, disgusting-looking 15-year-old mouse that you never bothered to throw out anyways. If you disagree with any of that, let me know in the comments, because I'm very curious who actually does. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay, signing off. Thanks for stopping by. Ain't nothing but a Logitech G thing, baby. That doesn't have the same ring to it. So, yeah, I actually tried to learn how to use the Logitech G software, and I found the spot where you can write your profile on the computer onto the hardware of the mouse and have it go with the mouse somewhere else. Click.
Epic fail.
Somebody is gonna call me a boomer for that one. But hey, welcome to the wonderful world of the 2020s, where you need to program your mouse with software and write to the flash ROM or whatever. Hold on a second, I gotta reflash my mouse. What kind of a world have we run into these days, huh? MultimediaJay out.
You are